Some men go their entire lives without speaking more than a dozen words to another soul. Kalen Moss had perfected that silence over 7 years on his isolated homestead, where the only voices he heard were the wind through the grain and the occasional protest of his barn door. He preferred it that way. People asked questions, people expected answers, people saw through him like he was made of glass. But on the night, everything changed. It wasn't a person who shattered his carefully constructed solitude. It was the sound of something dying in his barn. The noise came just after the moon cleared the ridge, a wet, rattling gasp that didn't belong to any animal he owned. Kalen stood motionless in his doorway, lantern trembling in his grip, every instinct screaming at him to bar the door and pretend he'd heard nothing. That's what the old Kalen would have done. That's what 7 years of self-imposed exile had taught him. Instead, his feet carried him across the yard. The barn door hung open. He always latched it, always, which meant someone or something had gotten inside. Callan's hand tightened around the lantern as he stepped into the darkness, the flame casting wild shadows against the stacked hay bales and empty stalls. That's when he saw her. She lay crumpled in the corner like a broken doll, half buried in loose straw, dark hair spilled across her shoulders, and her clothing, leather adorned with intricate beadwork, was soaked with something that looked black. In a dim light, blood, too much of it. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and uneven. Apache, the word hit him like a fist. Kalen had lived far enough from settlements to avoid most conflicts, but even he knew the tensions that simmered across the territory. He knew the stories, he knew the fear, and he knew that harboring someone like this, someone clearly fleeing from something, could get him strung up or worse. He should have walked away, should have saddled his horse and ridden to the nearest outpost, should have let someone else handle this impossible situation. But her eyes opened. They locked onto his with an intensity that froze him where he stood. No fear, no pleading, just a silent assessment, as if she were measuring whether he was worth the effort of staying conscious. Her lips moved, forming words in a language he didn't understand. And then her hand shifted, revealing something carved into the dirt floor beneath her, symbols, deliberate marks etched with a fingertip. Dipped in her own blood, Kalen's throat closed. She wasn't just hiding, she was leaving a message for who? Her people, her pursuers. And why here? Why his barn? On his land, on the one night he'd actually heard the door open. He knelt beside her, the lantern light catching the rise and fall of her chest, growing weaker with each breath. She needed help, real help, the kind he had no idea how to give. But the nearest settlement was hours away, and she'd never survived the journey. Her hand suddenly shot out and gripped his wrist with startling strength. Her eyes bore into his, and she spoke one word, sharp, clear, desperate, a name, a warning, a command. And then the sound of horses echoed across the valley, distant, but closing fast. The horses were getting closer. Kalen's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. If those riders found her here, they'd assume he was involved, complicit, maybe even the one who'd hurt her in the first place. He'd be dragged from his home, his land seized, his carefully maintained distance from the world shattered in a single violent night. But her grip on his wrist hadn't loosened. Even now, fading in and out of consciousness, she held on like she was anchoring herself to something solid. To him, he made his decision in the space between heartbeats. Kalen grabbed an armful of hay and scattered it over the symbols she'd drawn, obscuring them completely. Then he lifted her, surprised by how light she felt despite the strength in her grip, and carried her deeper into the barn, pasted the empty stalls to the back corner where he stored winter supplies. A tarp-covered pile of grain sacks formed a natural alcove. He laid her behind them, pulled the tarp down to create a makeshift curtain, and pressed his hand gently against her shoulder. Her eyes opened again, this time understanding flickered there. She nodded once, then went still. Kalen emerged from the barn, Just as 3 riders crested the ridge, they wore no uniforms, no badges, nothing that marked them as law, just men with rifles and hard expressions, the kind who ask questions with their hands instead of their mouths. The lead rider pulled up short, his horse snorting and stamping. He was older, with a scar that split his left eyebrow in half. "You see anyone come through here?" Callan's throat tightened. Speaking to strangers, his worst nightmare made real. He forced himself to shake his head, keeping his eyes down the way he always did. "Don't play dumb." The rider leaned forward in his saddle. "Apache. Woman injured. She couldn't have gotten far." Another rider circled toward the barn. Kalen's pulse hammered against his ribs. If they searched inside, if they moved the tarp, if they found the blood soaked straw, check the barn, the scarred man ordered. Kalen stepped forward before he could stop himself. The movement was small, barely a shuffle, but it put him between the riders and the barn door. All 3 men turned to stare at him. "Something you want to say?" The scar man's hand drifted toward his rifle. Kalen opened his mouth. No words came. They never did when it mattered. His face burned with the familiar shame of being unable to function like a normal person, unable to defend himself, unable to. "He's simple," the 3rd rider said, disgust dripping from his voice. "Look at him, probably doesn't even know what day it is." The scarred man studied Callan for a long moment. Then he spat into the dirt. "Waste of time. She's probably halfway to the canyon by now." He wheeled his horse around. "Come on." They rode off, their silhouettes disappearing over the ridge as quickly as they'd come. Callan stood frozen in his yard, listening to the thunder of hooves fade in the silence. His hands were shaking, his chest felt tight, but she was still hidden, still safe for now. He returned to the barn and pulled back the tarp. Her eyes were open, watching him with that same intense assessment. But something had changed. The way she looked at him now carried a weight he didn't understand. She lifted her hand and touched 2 fingers to her chest, then extended them toward him. A gesture, a promise, a debt acknowledged, and Kalen realized with creeping dread that saving her life might have been the easy part. Kalen had never tended to anything more complex than a fence post splinter. Now he knelt beside a woman bleeding from a gash that ran from her shoulder to her ribs with no idea what to do and no one to ask. He'd brought water from the well, clean cloth torn from his spare shirt, and a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for winters that felt too long. She watched him approach with those dark, assessing eyes. Her jaw set against pain she refused to show. When he poured the whiskey over the wound, her entire body went rigid, not a sound, not a whimper. Just her hand curling into a fist, so tight her knuckles went white. Kalen had cried out loud the time he'd burned his palm on a cook stove. This woman was enduring something 10 times worse and wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing her break. He worked as gently as he could, cleaning the wound and binding it with strips of cloth. His hands shook the entire time, not from fear of her, but from the simple reality of being this close to another person. He could smell the leather of her clothing, the copper tang of blood, the faint scent of sage that clung to her hair. When he finished, she caught his wrist again. This time, her grip was weaker, but deliberate. She guided his hand to the symbol she'd drawn earlier, the ones now hidden under scattered hay. Then, she pressed his palm flat against the barn floor and dragged it in a straight line, away from the marks. Away. She was telling him to stay away from those symbols. Ken's throat tightened. Why? Were they a warning? A boundary? Something sacred he'd already violated by covering them. She released his hand and pointed at him, then at herself, then made a motion like breaking something in half. The meaning was clear enough. Whatever those symbols meant, they were dangerous for both of them. Over the next 3 days, she barely spoke. When she did, it was in her own language, words that flowed like water over stones, beautiful and incomprehensible. Kalen brought her food, changed her bandages, and learned to read her expressions instead of waiting for words that wouldn't come. A slight nod meant yes. A flat stare meant no. A tilt of her head meant she was listening to something he couldn't hear. That last one happened often. She'd go still as death, her eyes fixed on the barn wall, her breathing shallow. Then she'd relax, satisfied that whatever she'd heard posed no threat. Callan started listening to straining to catch the sounds that put her on edge. Riders. In the distance, the crack of branches, the cry of a hawk that might not be a hawk at all. He was learning her language without words, and somehow, impossibly, she was learning his. On the fourth morning, he brought her breakfast and found her sitting upright, the bandage removed, examining the wound. With a critical eye, it had closed cleanly, no infection she'd heal with. Nothing but a scar to show for it. She looked at him and spoke a single word in English, heavily accented, but unmistakable. Callan, his name, she knew his name, but he'd never told her. He'd never told anyone out here, which meant she'd been conscious enough, aware enough to search his belongings while he slept, to learn who he was while he thought she was helpless. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like being seen for the first time in 7 years. She stood, tested her weight, and nodded to herself. Then she looked at him with something that might have been regret, and Callan knew with sinking certainty that she was about to leave. She left that night without a sound. Callan woke to cold air drifting through the barn door, the same door he'd latched before sleeping. He knew before he even looked that she'd be gone. A tarp hung loose. The grain sacks sat undisturbed. The space where she'd lain for 4 days showed only a faint impression in the straw, but she'd left something behind. A small leather pouch sat on the overturned crate he'd used as a makeshift table. Inside, he found dried herbs he didn't recognize, a carved piece of turquoise no bigger than his thumbnail, and a single feather bound with sinew. No note, no explanation, just objects that clearly meant something in a language he couldn't speak. Callan stood in the empty barn as dawn broke over the ridge, holding the pouch and feeling the absence of her like a physical weight. For 4 days, his world had contained another person, someone who didn't expect him to talk, who communicated in glances and gestures, who trusted him with her life. Now she was gone, and he was alone again. The silence felt different this time, heavier, like it had teeth. He went through his routines mechanically, fed the horses, checked the fence line, hauled water from the well, but his eyes kept drifting to the ridge, half expecting to see her silhouette against the sky, or worse, to see those riders returning with questions he still couldn't answer. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The wound on his palm where he'd cut himself fixing a gate healed faster than the strange, hollow feeling in his chest. He caught himself listening for sounds that never came. The rustle of someone moving in the barn, the cadence of a language he didn't understand, the weight of eyes watching him work. He started talking to himself just to break the silence, narrating his actions like a fool. Check. The corral gate needs a new hinge. Maybe, too, the sound of his own voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. At night, he'd take out the leather pouch and examine its contents by lamplight, try to decode their meaning. Medicine, a blessing, payment for services rendered, or something else entirely, something that required knowledge he'd never possess. The turquoise caught the light in strange ways, sometimes blue, sometimes green, sometimes both at once. On the morning of the 32nd day, Callan was mending a section of fence when his horse suddenly lifted its head, ears forward, nostrils flaring. That stance meant only one thing. Riders, his heart kicked against his ribs. Had those men returned? Had someone finally connected him to the Apache woman's disappearance? He reached for the post driver, the closest thing to a weapon within reach, and turned toward the ridge. What he saw stopped his breath in his chest. Dozens of riders crested the hill in a perfect line, not scattered, not searching, deliberate, organized, moving with the precision of a military formation. And at their center, mounted on a paint horse, sat a figure he recognized even from a distance. Aida had returned. But she hadn't come alone. She'd brought what looked like half her tribe, warriors in full regalia, horses adorned with feathers and beadwork, carrying lances that caught the morning sun like flames. They weren't attacking, they weren't charging. They were approaching his property with the formality of a delegation. And Ken, who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to another soul in 7 years, stood frozen in his yard as an entire Apache war party rode toward him in complete silence. They stopped 50 yards from his property line, not advancing, not retreating, just waiting. In perfect formation, their horses standing as still as carved stone. Kalen's legs refused to move. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything except stand there like a target. But his body had locked up the way it always did when confronted with more than one person at a time. This wasn't one person. This was an army. Aida dismounted first. Even from a distance, he could see the way she moved, deliberate, controlled, fully. Healed. She'd been weak and bleeding the last time he saw her. Now she carried herself like someone who'd never known a moment of vulnerability in her life. 2 older men dismounted beside her. One carried a long staff decorated with feathers. The other wore more elaborate clothing than the rest, his chest adorned with intricate beadwork and what looked like bone ornaments. A leader, maybe your father, they began. Walking toward him, Call's throat closed completely. He couldn't have spoken if his life depended on it, and it might. For all he knew, this was revenge. Maybe hiding her had violated some sacred law. Maybe those symbols in the barn had been a death curse, and she'd returned to carry it out properly. His hand tightened around the post driver he'd forgotten. He was holding a pathetic defense against 3 dozen warriors. But it was all he had. Aida reached the fence line first and stopped. She looked at him with those same intense eyes, but something had changed. The assessment was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like nervousness, which made no sense. She commanded warriors. He could barely manage a conversation with his own horse. The older man with the staff stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "You're Kalen Moss. You own this land." It wasn't a question, but Kalen nodded anyway. His hands were shaking visibly now. He hoped they couldn't tell. "My name is Kurik. I speak for our people." The old man gestured to the elaborately dressed warrior. "This is Takakota, leader of our band. And, you know, Aida, daughter of Takakota, warrior of our tribe." Daughter, of course, that explained the formal procession. They'd come for justice, for retribution. A white man hiding their leader's daughter could only mean one thing to them. "She has told us what you did," Kurik continued. Kalen's heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. "You gave shelter when she had none. You risked your life when men with weapons came searching. You asked for nothing, expected nothing, and when she was strong enough to leave, you did not try to keep her." The old man paused, letting the words settle. "In our tradition, such actions create a bond, a debt that must be honored, but Aida does not wish to repay this debt in the way of warriors with goods or service." Kurik's expression shifted into something Kalen couldn't read. "She wishes to honor it in the way of her heart." Aida stepped forward. She reached up and removed a necklace from around her neck, turquoise and silver, clearly precious. Then she did something that made Kalen's mind go completely blank. She knelt, not a crouch, not a stumble, a deliberate formal kneel in the dust of his yard. Her head bowed, the necklace extended in both hands like an offering. Kurik spoke again, his voice carrying across the silent valley. "Aida, daughter of Takakota, ask for your hand in the way of our people. She offers herself as wife, as partner, as the one who will stand beside you for all the days you both shall walk this earth." The world tilted sideways. Kalen couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was hearing. 3 dozen Apache warriors watched him in absolute silence, waiting for an answer he had no idea how to give. Marriage. The word bounced around Kalen's skull like a trapped bird. She was asking him to marry her in front of her father, in front of her entire tribe, in front of warriors who could cut him down before he took 3 steps. This had to be a test, some kind of elaborate Apache trial where the wrong answer meant swift execution. Maybe she'd been ordered to do this. Maybe her father had demanded she repay the debt this way, and she was as trapped as he felt. But when Ken forced himself to look at her, really look at her, he saw no resentment in her posture, no shame. She knelt in his yard with her head bowed, offering herself freely, and the only emotion visible on her face was hope. Hope that he'd say yes. His mouth opened, nothing came out. 7 years of self-imposed silence had calcified his voice into something useless. He tried again, forcing air past the knot in his throat. The word came out as a croak. I don't. Ida's head lifted slightly. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Callan saw past the warrior, past the daughter of a chief, past the woman who'd bled in his barn. He saw someone who understood what it meant to be isolated, to be different, to communicate in ways that didn't require words. She'd chosen him, not because she had to, not because tradition demanded it, but because in 4 days of silence and shared space, she'd seen something in him worth keeping. Why? The word escaped before he could stop it. Kurik translated. Aida responded in her own language, her voice steady and clear. The old man listened, then turned to Ken. She says, You gave her safety when you had every reason to fear. You touched her wounds with gentle hands when other men would have taken advantage. You asked for nothing and expected less. Kurik paused. She says, You're the first man who has seen her without trying to make her smaller, and that is worth more than all the warriors in our tribe combined. Kalen's vision blurred. He wasn't crying, he'd gone 7 years without crying, but his eyes burned anyway. I can't. He forced the words out. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't even know how to talk to people. Kurik translated. Aida's response was immediate. She says she does not need words. She needs someone who will not run when she bleeds. Someone who will stand between her and danger even when his hands shake. Someone whose first instinct is protection, not possession. The old man's expression softened. She says, You have already proven yourself worthy. This ceremony is merely the formality. Behind Aida, Takakota remained expressionless, but his hand rested on the ornate weapon at his belt, not threatening, just present. A reminder that this moment carried weight beyond romance. Kalen's answer would forge or sever a connection between two worlds that rarely touched without bloodshed. He looked at the woman kneeling in his yard, at the tribe watching from their horses, at the life he'd built in isolation, safe and small, and slowly suffocating. She was offering him something impossible, something terrifying, something he desperately wanted without knowing he'd been searching for it. Kalen dropped the post driver. It hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed across the silent valley. Then he took 3 steps forward, closing the distance between them, and did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He reached out first, his hand found hers, her fingers closed around his with the same grip that had anchored her to life 4 weeks ago. And when he helped her to her feet, the warriors behind her began to chant, a rhythmic, ancient sound that rolled across the land like thunder. Kalen had said yes without speaking a word, and somehow, impossibly, she'd understood perfectly. The ceremony lasted until the sun reached its highest point. Kalen understood almost none of it. Kurik translated the essential parts, the exchange of promises, the binding of hands with woven cord, the sharing of water from a carved wooden bowl. But most of the ritual unfolded in a language that flowed past him like a river, beautiful and incomprehensible. Aida stood beside him throughout, her hand steady in his. When the elders spoke, she responded with confidence. When they asked him questions through Kurik, she waited patiently while he stammered through answers that felt inadequate. And when Takakota finally stepped forward and placed both hands on their joined wrists, his expression remained unreadable. The chief spoke at length. Kurik translated in careful pieces. Takakota says his daughter has chosen a path he did not expect, but he has watched you, Kalen Moss. He sent scouts after his daughter disappeared. They reported that a white farmer turned away armed men with nothing but silence and stubbornness. The old man paused. He says there are many kinds of courage. The loudest is not always the strongest. Takakota released their hands and stepped back. The warriors lowered their Lances in unison. A gesture Kurik explained meant acceptance, not approval, not celebration, just acknowledgement that the bond had been witnessed and sealed. Then, one by one, the tribe departed. They mounted their horses in the same perfect formation and rode back over the ridge, leaving Kalen and Aida standing alone in the yard like survivors of storm. The silence felt different now, charged with possibility instead of emptiness. Aida turned to him and spoke carefully in English, each word deliberate. We learned together 4 words, more than she'd ever spoken to him in his language. Callan's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting himself to respond. She walked toward the barn and he followed. Inside, she knelt beside the spot where she'd hidden weeks ago and brushed away the scattered hay, revealing the symbols she'd drawn in blood and dirt. They'd faded but remained visible, 3 interconnected circles with lines radiating outward. Ida touched the first circle and said a word in her language. Then she pointed at Ken and repeated it. She touched the second circle, pointed at herself, and said another word. Finally, she traced the third circle, the one that connected the other 2, and said something that sounded like a question. Kalen knelt beside her, studying the design, slowly. Understanding dawned. The first circle was him, the second was her, the third was the space they would create together, not his world, not hers, something new that required both of them to exist. He picked up a piece of charred wood from the cold fire pit and drew a 4th line connecting all 3 circles, completing the pattern. When he looked up, Aida was smiling. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. The expression transformed her entire face, softening the sharp edges of the warrior into something warm and startlingly vulnerable. She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture so gentle it made his chest ache. That night they sat together outside the barn, watching stars emerge one by one across the endless sky. She taught him words in her language. He taught her more words in his. Most of what they communicated still happened without speech, through glances and small movements, and the comfortable silence of 2 people learning to occupy the same space. Kalen realized somewhere between midnight and dawn that he hadn't felt afraid once since the ceremony ended. The panic that usually gripped him around others had vanished because Aida didn't need him to perform. She just needed him to be present, and for the first time in 7 years, being present felt like enough. 3 months changed everything and nothing. The land looked the same. The barn still needed repairs. The fence line still demanded constant attention. But Ken no longer worked alone. Aida moved through his world like she'd always belonged there, teaching him efficiency he'd never considered and learning his methods with the patience of someone who understood that change took time. She was a better hunter. He was a better planter. Together, they kept the homestead running smoother than it ever had when he'd shouldered everything alone. The first time riders appeared on the ridge, Kalen's old panic tried to resurface, but Aida simply stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and the fear dissolved. The riders turned out to be traders looking for a shortcut to the next settlement. Kalen managed to give them directions, without his voice breaking once. Small victories, but they accumulated. Kurik visited twice, bringing supplies and news from the tribe. He taught Kalen more of their language and praised Aida's growing command of English. On his second visit, he examined the symbols in the barn and nodded approvingly. You understood, he said simply. Not many would. The turquoise necklace Aida had offered during the proposal now hung above their door. She'd explained through careful words and patient gestures that it had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who'd also married outside tradition and built a life that honored 2 worlds instead of choosing one. Kalen thought about that often, how his isolated existence had been a kind of cowardice dressed up as preference, how Aida's arrival had forced him to choose between the safety of solitude and the risk of connection. He'd chosen risk, and it had given him everything. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun paint the mountains gold, Aida leaned against his shoulder and spoke in English, happy One word, but it contained a universe of meaning. Was he happy? Was this life enough? Did he regret the choice? Kalen turned to look at her, at the woman who'd bled in his barn and returned with an army, at the warrior who'd knelt in the dust and offered herself freely, at the person who'd seen worth in a man too afraid to speak and decided he was worth fighting for. Yes, he said. The word came. Easily, no stammer, no hesitation, happy. She smiled that rare, transformative smile and settled closer against him. In the distance, a hawk cried out. The wind moved through the grass. The world continued its endless turning, but Callan wasn't counting the ways he'd failed anymore. He was counting the moments he'd succeeded, the days he'd woken beside someone who understood silence as a language instead of a flaw, the nights he'd fallen asleep without the crushing weight of isolation pressing against his chest. 7 years ago, he'd chosen to disappear, to become invisible, to exist in the margins where people couldn't hurt him. But Aida had found him anyway, and instead of dragging him back into a world that had never fit right, she'd built a new one with him, a place where his quietness was strength, where his gentleness was valued, where being seen didn't mean being diminished. The shy farmer who'd hidden an Apache woman in his barn had become something he'd never imagined possible. He'd become someone who no longer needed to hide. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and connection reshape destinies in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything too.